One of the most peculiar voices to have come out of post-war Britain, he transformed loneliness, anguish, and seizures into a hypnotic, icy sound that the entire world was unable to ignore. If you believe Ian Curtis, the author of Love Will Tear Us Apart, was only the lead vocalist of the cult band Joy Division, you're mistaken. He passed away at the age of 23. Then you're losing out on a tale that is both more tragic and exquisite than any song he has ever performed. He had been a board office clerk, a depressed teen who almost died from taking prescription drugs at the age of 16, a husband who married at the age of 19, had a child, and then had an affair before he even knew what love was, and an epileptic who still performed on stage, dancing as though the music he made was tearing him apart. This is Ian Curtis's journey, which has never been told in its whole until now. He is not only a post-punk legend but also the personification of a lost, desperate generation that refused to remain silent. Early life. Ian Kevin Curtis was born in Stretford, Greater Manchester, on July 15, 1956. A post-industrial suburb with red brick walls, smoky roads, and an endlessly bleak sky. His family relocated to the small, peaceful, and unobtrusive town of Macclesfield when he was only a few years old, where everything was supposed to be quiet, steady, and normal. In post-World War II Britain, the Curtis family was a typical example of a working-class household. Kevin Curtis, his father, worked as an aeronautical engineer. Pragmatic, icy, and accurate to the tiniest movement. Doreen, his mother, was a clerk who was neat, quiet, and infrequently talkative. Emotions, particularly in youngsters, were frequently viewed as complex or dreamlike in such an atmosphere. Ian had always been different from other kids. He never joined friend groups, didn't like jokes, and didn't like sports. Rather, he enjoyed reading books by himself, particularly classic literature and poetry. He devoured Wordsworth's writings about identity, death, and loneliness since he loved him so much. As he grew older, he developed a deep interest in existential philosophy and the meaninglessness of existence. By the time he was 14 or 15, friends remembered that Ian frequently discussed death in a detached, logical manner, as though it were a topic of study. Not a cause for alarm. Then came the first milestone of darkness, the age of 16. After taking too many prescription medications for anxiety and headaches, Ian ended himself in the hospital. To save his life, doctors had to pump his stomach. His family said it was an accident, but many who knew Ian well disagreed. They were aware that it was his first transgression, a litmus test, and a means of determining whether or not the world genuinely cared about him. He was not changed by having survived that incident. Ian became even more reserved, reflective, and aloof. School turned into a mental torture chamber. Ian was someone who couldn't conceal the fractures inside and had no one to truly confide in a society that was still deeply rooted in conservatism and taught men to be strong and quiet. Ian did not attend university after graduating from high school. Rather, he accepted a position at the Macclesfield Employment Center, where he assisted the crippled and jobless in finding jobs. There, he came across lives that were even more sinister than his own, and he somehow felt a sort of kinship. He didn't sympathize or pass judgment. He just watched, calmly documenting everything as though it were for an unformed entity. A young woman with epilepsy was one of his clients. She visited on a regular basis until one week when she stopped. Later, Ian learned that she had suffered a seizure and passed away while sleeping. He was haunted by the death. It sparked the idea for one of his most eerie tunes in addition to reawakening his fear of losing control. She has lost her composure. The terrible irony was that Ian soon started to have identical symptoms, including headaches, hand numbness, and blackouts. Slowly, seizures started to appear in his life. As though the girl's passing had not only served as motivation but also as a premonition of his own destiny. Ian married his adolescent lover, Deborah Woodruff, in 1975 when he was barely 19 years old. It was a typical social decision. Get married, get a home, and start a family. We married too young, Deborah would later acknowledge. Neither of us was old enough to recognize that we were stuck, and we were both unhappy. At a time when they should have been dreaming, they signed the mortgage documents while silently suffering emotional paralysis, depression, and disillusionment. Ian had not yet made music his career at that time. He was able to express himself there in a way that was more akin to an escape than anything he could in real life. Furthermore, he was unaware that the same thing would save him before destroying him. Summer 1976 was the beginning of the career. 3 young males saw the Sex Pistols perform in a small space at Manchester's Lesser Free Trade Hall among a rowdy audience. Peter Hook, the future bassist for Joy Division, was one of them. Bernard Sumner, who would later serve as the band's guitarist and keyboards, was another. The third was Ian Curtis, who was standing in a dark corner with the word hate emblazoned on the back of his dark overcoat. It was more than just a concert that evening. It was a tremor that rocked Manchester's stale, musical landscape, a cultural eruption. A city where young people without jobs were looking for something more than the slick, produced sounds of the mainstream and boring routines. Hook purchased his first bass immediately following the performance by borrowing £35 from his mother. Sumner purchased an instrument. Terry Mason was their drummer when they established a band. A voice was all that was lacking. On the door of the nearby Virgin Records store, they put a poster seeking a vocalist. Shortly after, Ian Curtis, who was already acquainted with the local punk scene, arrived and joined without having to try out. He was picked for his presence more than his skill. "We didn't need someone good," as Sumner subsequently stated. "Ian was the person we needed and wanted to be with." Inspired by David Bowie's song Warsaw from the album Low, they initially called themselves Warsaw. They played 3 chords, raw punk, high speed, and aggression, but things quickly changed. Because Ian's lyrics were unique, even though the music stayed straightforward. Ian wrote about death, emptiness, control, fear, and the ghosts in one's head, while other punk bands sang about politics, sex, or street resistance. To avoid being confused with a band called Warsaw Pact, they changed their name to Joy Division in 1978 following a few early performances and rudimentary recordings. The book House of Dolls, which described brothels where Nazi soldiers exploited Jewish female prisoners, served as the dark source for the new, ironically happy moniker. There was disagreement around the name. Particularly when the cover art for their first EP, An Ideal for Living, showed a boy playing a drum while wearing a Hitler Youth uniform. They were accused of having Nazi inclinations, but in reality, their actions were a cold, defiant statement and an act of aesthetic provocation. Joy Division lacked technological expertise in their early stages. They have no idea how to write songs in a structured way. Sumner would keep playing chords until he found the right one. Morris would drum, Hook would add a bass line, and Ian would sit quietly and write lyrics almost like a translator who transforms sound into obsession. Even though it was still amateurish, their music started to have a distinct tone that was authentic, icy, and grim. Ian Curtis changed when he was on stage. With violent movements, sometimes like someone being electrocuted, he launched himself into space. At first, audiences believed it to be an act, a reference to Bowie or Iggy Pop. The reality, however, was more unsettling. On stage, Curtis frequently experienced real seizures brought on by pulsing drums and flashing lights. It was difficult to distinguish between art and disease. The alternative press started taking notice of Joy Division in 1979. Journalist John Savage called them after they performed at the Electric Circus. Shortly after, they joined with Factory Records, where they were mentored by Tony Wilson, a forward-thinking producer who would elevate Joy Division to new heights. They worked with producer Martin Hannett to make their debut album, Unknown Pleasures, later that year. Hannett chose a more subdued style, including floating synths, ambient noise, delay, and expansive soundscapes, in contrast to the raw fury of punk. Although Hannett created a sonic environment where Ian Curtis' loneliness rang like a scream for aid, some early fans were upset by the transition. Joy Division was not a punk band anymore. They were post-punk pioneers and the starting point for one of the most tortured and captivating voices Britain had ever produced. They were also unaware at the time. Months were already being used to measure their time. Professional breakthrough. The British music scene had never heard anything like Unknown Pleasures when it was launched in June 1979. Between persistent bass rhythms, icy mechanical drumming, and Ian Curtis' baritone voice echoing like a prophecy of estrangement, there was just oppressive silence. There were no love lyrics, catchy climaxes, or dazzling guitar solos. Unknown Pleasure's success was not attributed to its position on charts. Joy Division was at the forefront of a new genre of music known as post-punk, which was defined by the press as a new sonic explosion. The record evolved into a groundbreaking sound experiment with producer Martin Hannett. He employed electronic percussion, digital delays, and silence itself as an expressive technique in addition to separating the sounds in the mix. The end effect was a soundscape reminiscent of a deserted train station, where an underlying loneliness reverberated in every sound. The band members weren't happy with the result at first. They felt that Hannett's music was too crisp and icy, but time showed that they were mistaken. Not sure. Pleasures was more than just a debut, it served as a model for a whole generation of musicians, including Radiohead, Interpol, The Cure, and the Bauhaus. It was later dubbed the sound of the future by Mojo magazine. And it was. The record still has an eerily contemporary vibe more than 40 years later. Joy Division saw a surge of activity after the album's release. They toured Europe, started touring the UK, made an appearance on BBC Two, and received their first invitation to perform in the US in the middle of 1980. They were immediately acknowledged as the most significant band to come out of Manchester since the Beatles, even though they continued to project a cold, uninvolved image in the media. They started recording Closer, their second album, at the end of 1979. Closer was a record of hopelessness, but Unknown Pleasures was a portrayal of detachment. The music, which was still created by Hannett, grew more ceremonial, heavier, and darker. Songs like Atrocity Exhibition, Colony, and 24 Hours have evolved beyond simple melodies. As the title of the album implies, these were broken sound structures that were desolate and hollow. She's Lost Control, which was based on Ian's actual experience working with a young woman who had epilepsy, is among the most striking songs from this era. The tune feels like you're watching a seizure turned into sound in the studio version because of the irregular drum machine, shaky synths, and anxious vocals. Among Joy Division's most audacious and eerie creative moments, one of the final songs recorded prior to Ian Curtis' passing, Love Will Tear Us Apart, followed. It wasn't on Closer, but it was the band's first song to get close to being a hit. It became a posthumous hit due to its more approachable tune, ethereal bassline, and gentle synths, but the lyrics were what really made it powerful. It is a chilly, clinical examination of a failing relationship rather than a celebration of love or a dream. The single has a sophisticated yet incisive sound because it was recorded at Strawberry Studios and finished at Pink Floyd's Studio Britannia Row. For vocal inspiration, Tony Wilson, the founder of Factory Records, even recommended that Ian listen to Frank Sinatra. The end effect was a performance that depicted emotional disintegration in a calm, unsettling way rather than screaming or pleading. Joy Division had been around for less than 4 years at the beginning of 1980. They didn't have any successful albums, extensive advertising campaigns, or attractive TV characters. However, they had established a new musical style, erasing the distinctions between rock and existentialism, music and mental illness, and punk and art. An era was characterized by this band. And the passing of their own frontman marked the start of that period in their own lives. Ian Curtis' life progressed in the same drab rhythm as thousands other post-war British youths before the stage called his name. Complete your education, get a job as a secretary, get married young, and attempt to maintain stability. Ian married Deborah Woodruff, whom he had known as a teenager in Macclesfield, in 1975 when he was just 19 years old. There was only a modest home, a long-term mortgage, 2 boring jobs, and a future that seemed peaceful and secure, no extravagant wedding or boisterous celebration. However, stability soon turned into a confining box. Deborah would eventually use the term drab mistake to sum up the first few years of their marriage. They were both too young to comprehend what they were looking for and what they were gradually losing, not because they didn't love each other. The voids in their small home grew as Curtis started spending more time on music. Natalie, their daughter, was born in 1979. It ought to have been a new start. Fatherhood, however, did not alleviate Curtis's sadness. It only made him more afraid that he wasn't sufficiently normal. He grew more and more quiet and aloof, as though he had a world within of him that Deborah was unable to access. Later that year, Joy Division embarked on a European tour. Ian met Annick Honoré, a Belgian journalist who works in event promotion, in Brussels. Curtis didn't flirt like other rock musicians do. He paid attention. He discussed poetry, alienation, and the dread of disappearing. They developed an uncertain relationship with one another. Half camaraderie, half haven from a collapsing world. Onik consistently insisted that their bond was not physical. However, the dozens, even hundreds, of lines of letters Curtis wrote her showed a side of himself that was kept private. He wrote to her as though he were writing to a different version of himself that he had never shown to anyone, even his wife and other musicians. Deborah quickly noticed the shift. She discovered the letters, sensed the increasing distance, and came to the realization that her husband was leading two lives, one as Natalie's husband and father in Macclesfield, and another as a lost man looking for comfort in the brittle light of Anik. There was only a prolonged period of calm that grew colder every day. There were no yelling contests or dramatic breakdowns. Deborah started the divorce paperwork. Curtis did not leave, nor did he protest. He remained, as if he was not sure whether to leave or just had nowhere else to go. Then his body started to turn on him. His seizures became more regular and deadly by the middle of 1979. Headaches and lightheadedness gave way to convulsions that sometimes occurred on stage. A strobe light malfunctioned one evening at the Rainbow, and Curtis shook and fell in the middle of his performance. Unconscious in front of hundreds of people. The performance was over. It served as a warning. However, nobody understood how to proceed. The band had previously been distinguished by Ian's erratic stage demeanor, which included trembling, jerking, and vacant look. However, it was no longer art, rather, it was a genuine dilemma involving a guy who had lost his self-control. Curtis was prescribed phenobarbital, carbamazepine, strong anticonvulsants, and sedatives, creating a hazardous drug concoction. In addition to causing mood swings, sleeplessness, confusion, even hallucinations, and severe depression, these drugs also suppressed seizures. According to his pals, Curtis changed during the last few months of his life. According to Peter Hook, he was no longer Ian. On some days, he would not talk, and on other nights, he would cry without knowing why. I think he was either overmedicated or misdiagnosed, and nobody realized how terrible it was until it was too late. Deborah could obviously see the change. It was more than a husband becoming aloof. It was a mentality that had nothing to cling to as it fell. Curtis would sometimes remain silent through the night, neither eating or talking. When Deborah would wake up in the morning, she would find him sitting quietly in the dark with his head in his hands and lifeless eyes that seemed to see through everything. "I love them both," Curtis once wrote in his journal. "I'm ruining everything, yet I don't want to hurt anyone." He became increasingly desperate in his messages to Onik. His songs for Joy Division started to seem like prophecies, sketches of breakdown, of losing control, of a love he could no longer comprehend. This was more than just a failing marriage. The intellect was gradually vanishing from the world. Death in the last years. Joy Division was poised to emerge as Britain's most significant post-punk band at the start of 1980. They were getting ready for their first US tour after finishing their second album, Closer, which was praised by the underground press as a metaphysical ritual in sound. However, this was not a high for Ian Curtis. It was a drop. A moment when memory, reason, and life all started to fall apart. Curtis has changed from his former self. His seizures had increased in frequency and frequently happened on stage. His shaking limbs, vacant looks, and jerking motions, which were once considered artistic trademarks, were now actual causes of fear. When a strobe light was inadvertently turned on during a performance in London, Curtis passed out in the middle of a severe seizure. The band remained still. Until he was carried off stage unconscious, the crowd believed it was a part of the performance. Medical care didn't really help. Curtis's nervous system reacted negatively to the strong anticonvulsants, carbamazepine, phenobarbital, and tranquilizers that were prescribed to him. He fell further into a downward spiral as a result of the adverse effects: insomnia, severe anxiety, sadness, and disassociation from reality. Later, Peter Hook thought Ian's prescription had been incorrect. The one individual who seems to genuinely comprehend his inner turmoil. Joy Division is a huge responsibility, not only for my mental and physical well-being but also for the futures of others, Curtis stated in letters to Onik. "I am at my breaking point." It was more than fatigue. Desperation without a voice. Ian overdosed on pills and attempted suicide for the first time on April 6, 1980. Was located and preserved. Following that, friends begged Curtis to call off the US trip, but he refused. He persisted, "I'm fine, I can do this," even though it was obvious that he was losing control. He hardly ate or slept in his last weeks. He would sometimes sit by himself in the dark, write letters and music, and watch Strosha while listening to Iggy Pop's Idiot on loop. A movie about a lost German musician who was betrayed, banished to America, and committed himself by living alone. Ian invited Deborah over on the evening of May 17, a few hours before his flight to the United States. They conversed. He pleaded with her to revoke the divorce decree. She remained the night despite her refusal because she was afraid of what might happen if she left him alone. They each slept in a different room. Ian instructed her to return at 10 a.m. the following morning. He had used a clothesline to hang himself in the kitchen when she got back. The stupid was spinning on the turntable as a refreshing cup of coffee sat on the table. There was simply a piece of paper requesting the neighbor to deliver a letter to Deborah, expressing his hope that they could reconcile and begin anew after the US tour. There was no suicide note. Many were perplexed by that message's simplicity. Did Curtis truly want to die, or was he just attempting to get out of a depressing situation for a few hours without realizing it would be the end? Peter Hook remembered saying, "I can't go to America. I am at my breaking point." However, he added that evening, "I'll take a break after the tour." I swear. Even to himself, he was in contradiction. After reviewing Curtis's prescriptions, a neurologist came to the conclusion that the pharmaceuticals he was taking at the time had the potential to cause unexpected, spontaneous suicidal thoughts. That is a ticking time bomb when dealing with extreme sleep loss. Curtis died too quietly and cleanly, as though it had been planned but not decided enough to qualify as a plan. The record was still spinning, he had just finished making coffee, and there was no farewell in the note. Some people think it was a panic attack brought on by weariness, medicine, and extreme loneliness rather than a conscious act. Maybe Ian didn't even realize what he was doing, he just couldn't stand it any longer. Ian Curtis was only 23 years old when he passed away. He never arrived in the United States. 2 months later, like an unconscious last will, Closer was freed. Love Will. Joy Division's first and last commercial success was Tear Us Apart. There is simply one line on his gravestone. Love, not a farewell, will break us apart. However, nobody ever truly understood it, not even he. Legacy and impact. Ian Curtis had a brief lifespan of 23 years. Joy Division was only around for 4 years. However, an indelible legacy was created from the ashes of a band that seemed to have been buried by tragedy. One that has reverberated for more than 40 years, not only in music but also deeply ingrained in Western culture. Closer, which came out after Curtis's passing, is today considered a post-punk classic and is cited alongside the Velvet Underground, Nico, and OK Computer as albums that helped define a certain era. No flamboyant pop illusions or defiant punk yells were present. Joy Division produced a minimalist soundscape in which emotion was neither emphasized nor hidden. Every song had the feel of a psychological diagnosis, cold, silent, harsh, and unavoidable. Ian Curtis' voice was at the center of that sound. A steady, low baritone that trembles, as if speaking in a dream. However, it appeared to reverberate from a deeper place than the body the more you listened. He didn't yell or plead for the audience's devotion. Like someone trapped between a seizure and a sleepwalk, he only described what was going on inside, using songs to hold on to what little sanity he still had. The impact of Curtis goes well beyond the tunes he sang. The remaining members of Joy Division founded the band New Order, which continued that musical heritage into contemporary electronic music and synth pop. Curtis, however, was never replaced. He turned into a spiritual compass for them. The enduring spirit in each live performance, song, and interview they did in the years that followed. His influence spread widely. Joy Division and Curtis were recognized as key influences by bands such as The Cure, 9 Inch Nails, Interpol, Radiohead, Editors, and Fontaines DC, who used them to inform their musical explorations of agony, remoteness, and existential angst. Trent Reznor once said, "Without Ian Curtis, there would be no me." Beyond music, Curtis became a postmodern cultural icon, a symbol for generations lost in the fog of industrialization, consumerism, and collapsing identities. In 2007, director Anton Corbin's film Control, based on Deborah Curtis' memoir Touching from a Distance, premiered to global acclaim. The film didn't just portray Curtis, it captured the paralyzing tension between duty and the longing for freedom, a feeling that millions of young people, even those far from music, have deeply known. In Macclesfield, where Curtis grew up and died, fans from around the world still visit like pilgrims. A statue erected in his honor was taken down just days later due to controversy, but that only reinforced a deeper truth. Curtis cannot be boxed in. He was never a celebrity, nor a cool figure to be commodified. He was a wound, and the one who dared open it so others could finally see. Ian Curtis's story isn't a tragedy to pity. It's a reminder of the things we often stay silent about. He never wanted to be a symbol, but became the voice for anyone who has ever felt lost.